real basics quick, and if there's any questions, come back and answer them. And I want to get to the technical stuff, because this technical stuff is what makes the difference. Right? The basics are just filler. And so here's one of the concepts of line design. When you overhead cast, the whole length of your line loads the rod. Right? You throw a back cast, if it weighs an ounce, or an ounce bends the rod. On a Spey cast, only a portion of the line weight bends the rod, because only a portion is behind you, and mostly is this back bit. So on any Spey line, or line designed for Spey casting, this part is the most important part for load, and this part is unload. It comes off the water, which means when you have a Spey line design, you're going to find almost every Spey line will have weight at the back. That's the crux of that. Like any Spey line you get, whether it's a single-handed line or a two-handed salmon line, in some way, whether it's the Skagits and Scandies and traditional Speys, they're going to have more weight at the back. And an overhead casting line is going to have more weight at the front. Right? That's just designed for overhead casting. And then to give you some terminology, there's two styles of lines. There's the shooting heads, which are independent pieces of line that you attach to a shooting line. And find the loop. Right, so there's two components, a shooting line and a shooting head, and you put them together to create one piecer. That's called a shooting head system. And then an integrated shooting head is basically this all thing with no knots. So there's the same head, and there's the same running line, but you can see there's no connections. Right, some people like the connections, some people don't want connections going up and down the rod rings. Point is, if you know that there's both, you can pick the one that you like. Personally, I like this because I don't like the loops going up and down my rings when I'm playing a fish. They don't really affect it, I just don't like them. So I like the integrated version. But the downside with the integrated version is when you buy the expensive line, you are stuck with this. And when you buy this head system, you know, you buy one reel, one thin line, and you have 2 or 3 heads. You can bet 3 heads for the price of one and change them out as conditions change. So there isn't a perfect system, but that's why there's 2 systems, integrated and regular shooting head. And then in the fly line world, really there's 3 styles of fly line. Skagits, Scandies, and traditionals. That's really, every fly line boils down to one of those 3. And what are the differences? The Skagit is pronounced Skagit. A lot of people call it Skagit for some reason. It's a river of Washington State in America, so they prefer you to call it Skagit. And then a Skagit, if it's a shooting head like this one, you have to have a shooting line like I showed you. Both versions have to have a tip. So if you have a Skagit, you need to buy a set of tips to have on front. You can't just fish a Skagit out your pocket and go. And then reason you pick a Skagit, and we'll see why as this talk progresses. Skagits are the most powerful lines. They have the most grains per foot. They're the shortest heads. They cast biggest flies. They're the easiest to cast. They're the best lines in the tightest of spaces. So in any of those scenarios, a Skagit is the right line of choice. Otherwise, the Scandinavian style is a better option. The Scandinavian lines for Atlantic salmon tend to be better because they have softer presentations. Skagits have heavy presentations, tend to land with more of a splash. The casts are more aggressive. It's not such a beautiful style of casting. So generally speaking, Skagits are the right tools, as we said just now, big flies, so early spring when the water's high, or back end when the water's high. You have to fish a heavy tube fly. Then the Skagit's type of line to go with. Otherwise a Scandi. And again, that's why this system perhaps has worked, because you can have a Skagit line for that big heavy wind, big fly day, and you can have a Scandi line for 90% of your fishing day and just change the heads. Saves you buying a reel, saves you buying another shooting line. All of these are set up and you just change heads. So a lot of people like this system. If you do a lot of changing, then this is a way to go. But again, you're going to have to contend with these loops going up and down, and at some point they become annoying, and then you just get 2 of everything. And you use the longer head, you said, didn't you?
Longer.
Longer, yeah.
No.
No, what are you using?
It's a outbound body.
Oh yeah, outbound body, yeah. So that's a Scandi head. That's a versatile version. which I'll get to. So longer head, longer front tapers, much better Atlantic salmon line for anything from, say, middle of April to end of September. Scandi is probably the right style of line, and on those fringe sizes the Skagits are a better option to go, unless you've got particularly high water. And then there is the traditional line. The traditional line is the long head line. It's like the Scandi, but instead of the head being 35 feet, the head is 65 or 75 feet or 55. It's a much longer head, and there's reasons to use that. The main reason is the penultimate bullet point: reduce stripping. If you make a 80-foot cast and your head is 30 feet, you have to pull 50 feet of line in every cast.
They're very similar to kind of double taper.
Yeah, same concept as that. Yeah, so if you, the long head, you pick up and go, you just swing. It becomes a much more efficient way of fishing because you're not stripping. And then the downside with it is if you go to the long head line, which this one is, and you put on a fly like a collie dog or something you want to strip, then you can't recast this because you stripped all the casting line into the floor. Then the short head becomes your friend. So this is why there's so many tools out there, because there's not just one way to fish. There's so many ways of fishing. Sorry. Again, just background information. We talked about the brick, you heard about the brick, so we won't need to go into that. Same thing with the flies. Flies, like when you look at a salmon fly, you know, you can get tube flies with cone heads on that really weigh a lot, get down in high water. Just got to find one. And this one doesn't look too heavy, but it's got a cone on, right? So this one, just to give you an illustration of the difference, 12 grains, right? So that's just a number. And that's a pretty short tube, little cone on it. I know I've got much heavier ones, brass tubes in particular. And then you fish an unweighted one or a lightweight one, like this, 4 grains. And so again, you're still going to have tools. You can call them tools, like a hammer and a screwdriver. If you've got a nail, use a hammer. So when you've got a heavy fly, use a Skagit. When you've got a light fly, use a Scandi. That's the other great rule of thumb. Grains, we talked about grains, so again there's no reason to go about what grains are. Grains per foot, Skagit, the same concept. You heard the trout one, we talked about grains per foot in the fly line, and the grains per foot in the fly line are very important on the Spey, because you can get plenty of Skagit heads that are 20 feet long, weighing 650, and you can get this long head Spey weighing 650. You know, this only averages 10 grains a foot, and this averages 32 grains a foot. So this thing will throw. I did a school a couple of years ago in America, in Virginia, for muskie anglers, trying to catch these pike muskie things, and they're fishing these 12-inch baitfish patterns, huge, lots of water and air resistance. And we had to dial in, even though the fly wasn't weighted, there's so much resistance in the water, we had to dial in to a 20-foot head, 650 grains, had 32 grains of power, and that moved these musky flies real easy. Didn't even know they were on there. But you put them on a regular line, and every cast people were making, the line just couldn't pick up these flies. So the important thing is to understand how load affects the end result. We want to make casting easy, and it becomes easy if you balance your gear out. The interesting part is when we get to talk about tips, because when you look at, like in this one, so here's a Skagit, this is actually a max power. And when you look at this Skagit, and I can pass this around, you can take a look, you'll see that the fat part is at the back, has to be because it's a Spey line. And then as you go forward, it's going to progressively get thinner until it gets to the thin front end. That's not thin, but that's because this is a Skagit. So this has got a lot of grains here. If you were to chop off this 1 foot and weigh it, I would guess this weighs 40 grains, and chop off this 1 foot, and this 1 foot probably weighs 15 grains, right? Because it's tapered. So why that's important is because you are going to attach to it some kind of tip. And that's what we're going to talk about, is tips. Hold that thought for a second, right? If let's say this is 15 grains and the back end of this is 40 grains. Just keep those numbers loosely in your mind for now. Well, this will make sense when we get to the tips. So when you go to the shop and you walk around and you say, I need some sink tips, and you walk around, you find a bunch of tips, you're going to find what we at RIO call replacement tips. You're going to find a bunch of sinking poly or versa leaders in different weights. You're going to find Mo tips. You're going to find T tips. It's like, for crying out loud, there's a lot of tips out here to catch a salmon. What do you need to do? First thing is, identify the type of tip. Is it a level tip or is it a tapered tip? So these two, as it says up there, level T, this is a 30-foot coil, just chop it 10 feet, chop it 15 feet, chop it 18 feet. You make the tip your length you want is level. The Mo tips are also level, right? These are level tips throughout. And why that is significant will be shown when you compare them to a tapered tip. Tapered tips obviously have a back end that's fat and a front end that's thin. And because it's thin, it lands better. You can kind of see which it is. I'll pass that around. You'll see which is the back end. And whenever you put these on, always make sure the fat bit goes to the back. You know, a lot of people put their tips on backwards, and that's a really big mistake because there's no label on and they can't identify it, and they put the thin end backwards and it doesn't turn over so well. So always put the thick end to the back. And then the other type of tip, similar sink rate to that one. Oh, thank you. Is a poly leader or versa leader, and that is a tip that is also tapered. You can kind of see the difference, and this is quite a lot thinner at the front end of that one, a lot thinner than the replacement tip, and that should give you a clue what kind of line and fly that gets onto. If it's thinner, it's lighter. If it's lighter, it can't cast a bigger fly. That's a nice little guideline to keep in the back of your mind. A lot of people use versa leaders as a way to take a floating salmon line, thank you, and put on a versa leader to get down and turn it into a sink tip. And whilst that's a good temporary fix, it's not the perfect fix, because if you put on a heavy fly, the front of these is so light, it can't turn them over. So you make the cast and the line goes out, and what you'll see is the poly leader versa leader goes out like this, and then the fly drops short, hasn't fully turned over. That's because this is too light to turn over that heavy fly. Again, this is the understanding of tips.
Should we use a replacement tip for that?
Has much more weight. Absolutely, absolutely much more weight. Da-di-da, we don't need to worry about these matching them on there. All you need to do is understand. Let's go back to this one. In the Mo tips, do you know what Mo tips are? Do you sell Mo tips here?
Yeah.
A few ones?
Yeah, we sell.
And people, okay. So a Mo tip, the concept of a Mo tip is quite simple, but very, very good. When you cast and you learn your Spey casting stroke, you get used to a certain length of line, 50 feet, 40 feet, whatever it is. And then you go fishing and you put on your Skagit head because the wind's blowing, or it's a heavy fly, or it's winter, and you have your 30-foot head, and you put on your 10-foot tip, and that's a 40-foot head, so your casting becomes good. And then you go down the pool and the ghillie says to you, right, you need to fish a really short sink tip, like a 3-foot sink tip, just to tuck in behind swinging behind a rock. You don't want a whole sink tip because it swings into the rock, but just drop it in behind. So you take off your 10-foot tip, put on a 3-foot sink tip, and now you've changed your length. So the concept of Mo tip, the guys who came up with this, was that the tip is always 10 foot long, but the sinking section differs. So this has 2.5 foot of sinking, 7.5 foot of floating. This has 5 feet of sinking and 5 feet of floating. You get it? 7.5 foot of sinking, 2.5 feet of floating, 10 of sinking. So it doesn't matter what sink tip length you have, the tip is always 10 foot. And that's a brilliant concept when you're learning spey casting and developing a rhythm and a style, and you're not changing your overall length every time you change your tip. So that's the concept behind mow tips. They're level, so they're big flies, but the tip length is always the same. And there's different types.
Would you need to put a tapered leader or something after a level?
No, you can put onto that. You can put on your 15 pounder Maxima, 6 feet, 4 feet, 12 feet, depending on your tip, what fly you've got on the end. But no, you don't need a tapered leader on that. And there's different families. I won't dwell on the different families at the moment. In the general rule of thumb, your light ones are for 6 weights and down. Not many people use 6 weight salmon rods, so forget the light. The medium ones are for 7 and 8s. The heavies are for 9s and 10s.
Would the light ones do for a 4-weight trout spey?
Perfect, absolutely. You have a trout spey? Now you're interesting me. I love trout spey, and I use those light mow tips on the trout spey. 4 weights, 3 weights and 5 weights. Fantastic for streamers.
Well, I've never used a tip on them at all. I've just put tapered leaders on them and never felt it was casting right, so that's probably why.
Yeah, if you're putting a heavy fly on, a heavy lure or streamer, then put on a little lightweight mow tip, and that will move it unbelievably easy. Even if it's a 2-weight, you get a 2-weight trout spey rod and a 2-weight Skagit and a light mow, and it'll throw the biggest streamers, and you don't even know they're on there because the tip has so many grains over the Versa leader or replacement tips. Replacement tips are a bit more complicated, very technical slide, but basically if you have a 7-weight rod and a 7-weight line and you put on a 7-weight tip, it balances out. You don't need the light, mediums and heavies. Somebody once told me, my ex-boss said, there's money in confusion. And I tell you what, spey casting should have a lot of money in it because there's so much confusion. I don't understand it, but there's so much confusion. So here's really what we're getting down to. We're getting down to the fact that a Skagit has much more weight at the front than a Scandi. And that means that when you attach a tip, again, there's a couple of slides that are essential, and this one being one of them. When you attach a tip to a body, the back of the tip must be equal to or slightly less than the front of the body. Very, very simple flow of energy. If you have it like this and the line starts to unroll and it gets lighter and lighter, as the line runs out of energy, that energy can roll to the end. But if your line gets lighter and lighter and then you suddenly put on something heavy, it just collapses. And so many people get that wrong. So many people take a line like this and they stick on a tip that weighs more than the front of the head, and then wonder why their casting goes to hell. And it goes to hell because they're asking this thin line to turn over a heavy head. It's nothing to do with what they've done. It's not like their casting suddenly gone wrong. They've just put on the wrong tip. So if you can understand what the right tip is to put on the end of your line and balance it, it's what makes for effortless spey casting, because again, when you make that cast and stop the rod, all the energy flows right to the fly and doesn't fight itself, so you find casting easy. And what a lot of people ask, your Scandi body is exactly what this is. So when this guy Jim Vincent, who designed Versatips first time, he said, these Scandis give nice presentation, lovely long tapers, and I need to get down and put on a sink tip. And the front of the Scandi, an 8-weight Scandi, weighs about 6 grains. So there's no way you can put on T14, that's 14 grains. There's no way you can put on T11, that weighs 11 grains. You can't put 11 grains on the front of that because you get that issue. So simply all he did was made a Scandi line like this and chopped it 15 feet from the front. And that's what a Versatip is. That's what your body is. Your body is exactly that. If these weren't chopped, this would be a complete taper to the front end. But because you've chopped it back, What it means is that the back end of this now has 15 grains a foot. So you could put the original tip back on, you could put a T11 tip on, or you could even put a T14 tip on, because they are all less than what you're attaching it to. That's the versatility of a VersaTip system, is they are cut back and can easily be re-added together to create the original, or you can put a whole pile of tips on to have the energy to cast. And that's why that VersaTip system, I think, is about the best salmon fishing system there is. I mean, it doesn't matter how many slides and how many products I talk about, all I fish, 99% of my summer fishing, or 100% of my summer fishing, is that. It's an integrated, exactly what you described, a Scandi body, no loops, just the body section, which is basically that VersaTip, chopped, and then I just add on the tips. I can add on the Mo tips if I need to throw a big fly or a windy stay. I can add on my replacement tips and get on here. So that system is about as good as you can get for Atlantic salmon fishing. I don't think there's a better way of doing it, no matter how many products are out there. Again, not everybody would necessarily want the integrated. You might want to change heads, but I don't think you need to. If you change tips, I think it's much easier doing it that way.
And again, it's just left tip of the end of the...
Yeah, once you add your tip, it still has to have a tip on, right? Because we've chopped a piece off. So once you've added that, you know, where I would change that myself is that if I'm putting a floating tip on and I look at the diameter of this floating tip here, I want to make sure my leader is about the similar diameter to that to continue the energy. So on my floating tips and my intermediate tips, I actually fish a tapered salmon leader, a 9-foot tapered salmon leader out of the packet. Again, the energy just runs all the way to the fly with that taper in your leader. But if you're fishing a fast sinking tip, a type 3 tip or a type 6 tip, and you want that fly close to the leader, the tip, because the tip sinks and you want to pull your fly down. So in this situation, I'd have 4 foot of 15-pound material, maximum, or whatever it is. But on floating and intermediates, I fish a 9-foot 12-pound or 9-foot 16-pound leader to the end. And again, that same energy rolls out because a taper is so efficient unrolling energy. It's got, rather than a level. Like if you had 9 or 12 feet of level 15-pound maxima, you would find it pretty hard to turn over that fly if there's a wind, or if the fly's got a little bit of air resistance or weight, because there's no flow of energy. That's with a tapered leader. Yeah. So continue the tapering. And again, really all we're saying there is that when you fish Skagit lines and Scandi lines, just make sure you match them up with the right flies and the right tips. So heavier the fly, the heavier the tip, the heavier the body, the heavier the rod. It's the same thing as we talked about in the trout, is you go from the fly back if you really want to balance things out for easy casting. And that's about, or I wanted to keep it short because there's, again, I just want to dial down to what I think is the best salmon outfit type. There's that integrated Scandi body, put on the tips you want, and you can change them up. And then in the winter, if you're fishing January, February, you will need a Skagit, probably a multi-density Skagit, like a game changer to get down because the water's cold and you've got to be in front of the fish. But generally speaking, once you reach 45, 46 degrees water temperature, which is kind of mid-April, you can be floating line and just an intermediate tip at most. What other questions? Any more questions? You guys obviously kind of know what you're talking about.
No, that's explained it for me.
Has it helped out? Like if you put the wrong tip, why it suddenly fails? You know what the other interesting slide is? I've stopped early, but there is an interesting slide, and this is the one it's a bit technical, but I think if you can, this might help some way or it might not. And that is what's called the ratio. Let's say your two-handed rod, one-handed rod, whatever, it's 10 foot long, and your whole fly line is 30 foot, right? That is 3 times the rod length. And so you spey cast away and you fish a small West Coast river, or you fish in Devon rivers like my home rivers, and you're fishing these little rods and these little lines, and then you come up to Scotland and the gillie gives you a 15-foot rod and a 45-foot line, and you go, oh God, this is a different animal. It's not, because it's still 3 times the rod length, right? So your casting stroke never ever changes. Where your casting stroke has to change is if you went with a 10-foot rod and a 45-foot head, now you have a 4.5 times ratio. So this, which worked with 3 times, doesn't work with 4.5 times. You have to lengthen your strokes. So when you mess around with ratios, casting becomes a lot harder. And generally speaking, why you say that is that includes any tip you add. Right? You might have a 30-foot head and go, I'm casting 30 feet of line and it's very comfy, and the gillie says put on a 10-foot versa leader or a 10-foot replacement tip, and he puts it on or you put it on. What an awful lot of people don't think is that they now lengthen their ratio to 4 times from 3 times, and they haven't changed the casting stroke to adapt. So keep that in mind. If you find you're going from long tips to short tips or no tips to long tips and your casting's failing, it's probably because your ratio has changed, not because the tip is hard to cast, but it could be the fact that you haven't done something to allow for this 4 times the rod length over 3 times the rod length. And I see that so many times when people will take a regular Scandi, fish it through a pool, and then put on a 10-foot or a 15-foot poly leader and can't cast it because they haven't changed. They haven't changed their technique. Anyway, a lot of technical stuff, but if there's a nugget you get out of that helps you next day on the water, then it helps you next day on the water.
Do you include the weight of your head?
Oh, that's a bloody brilliant one. I did have a slide for that. I took it out because I wanted to keep these short. So the answer to that is no. And the reason being, when you form, let's go back. Exactly. That's exactly it. And I tell you, so many people get that confused. When you make a Spey cast, this is the load, right? And let's say the load is from here to here. If you add a sink tip on, it's in the water in front of you. It's not making that load at all. And I have talked to dozens of people who say, oh, this rod says it needs 450 grains. My sink tip weighs 150 grains. So they put on a 300 grain head to make 450, because logically that makes sense. And it doesn't work because they don't have 450 grains load. So that's the other concept. It's an excellent question, is that your head is what takes to load the rod, and your tips, unless you're going to overhead cast, and then that's a different story because then it's part of your load. But for any Spey cast, because the tip is in the water in front of you, it doesn't form part of your load. So as long as this has more grains than the tip, it's a moot point. Brilliant question though.